Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's talk with Jennifer Natatalya Fink, presenting her new book, All Our Families, Disability, Lineage, and the Future of Kinship, joined in conversation by Corrine Manning. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our ever-expanding community. We host virtual and now, finally, in-person events at least 5 times a week. You can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's event will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask our speakers something, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, where you can submit a question at any point during the event. We'll get through as many as time allows for. Also, if you would like closed captions, please just click the live transcript tab on the bottom of your Zoom screen. In just a moment, I'm going to be posting the link to purchase tonight's featured book, All Our Families, in the chat box. Your book purchases make virtual author events like this possible, and they support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you so much for tuning in tonight. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as I am sure you've experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise, and if they do, I will do my very best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. The multi-talented Dr. Jennifer Natatalya Fink is a professor, author, and a mother. She's the director of the program in disability studies and is professor of English at Georgetown University. As a mother, parenting her autistic daughter has really been the center of Natalya's work. And along with her new book, All Our Families, Natatalya is the author of 6 books, including the award-winning novels Bhopal Dance and The Mikvah Queen. Lastly, she is the founder of the Guerrilla Press, a nonprofit promoting youth literacy through bookmaking. And tonight she's joined in conversation by teaching artist, writer, and critic Corinne Manning. Corinne authored a debut story collection, We Had No Rules, in 2020. They have received fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, Artist Trust, Hub City Writers Project, and the Banff Center. And their community work has focused on the visibility of underrepresented writers. Tonight, the two will be discussing All Our Families, in which Jennifer weaves her family narrative with disability scholarship and powerful insights into disability justice and care work. Both accessible and deeply complex, the book's been highly praised, including by author Jessica Slice, who writes, quote, "With exacting humanity, Fink demonstrates how our family lines can reflect and perpetuate ableist systems and offers ways to create a truer and more just lineage." We are so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. So without further ado, Natatalya, the digital podium is yours to begin with an opening.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank all of you for coming tonight amidst war, COVID, and all the rest. I am Jennifer Natatalya Fink, she, her, hers pronouns, a white middle-aged woman in a bright red shirt with black hair and a gray background. Welcome. I'm so delighted to be here today to share All Our Families, Disability, Lineage, and the Future of Kinship with you, and to be in conversation with the brilliant and genius Corinne Manning, who I'm lucky enough to call a friend. I am coming to you live from unceded Piscataway Nacotchunk territory in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. On unceded territory, I encourage you to take a moment to Google whose territory you are on. All you have to do is in the old Google say, whose territory am I on? And you will find out. So let's pause for a moment. Google away. So now you can't unknow that, right? Once you know it, you can't unknow it. You can't unsee it. You know whose territory you're on. Now, I personally kind of hate it when some white lady in, say, a bright red shirt gets up and makes this kind of virtue signaling proclamation. So let's turn this statement of fact into a call to action, a call to restorative justice for Nacatchunk, Piscataway, and all BIPOC people. And I invite you to join me in that work. I have some links, see if I can put them in the Q&A. Not sure if I can do that. I'll do it later. Go to nativegov.org and you can find some info there. www.piscatawaytribe.org, www.narf.org can help you and me think about how we move beyond land acknowledgement to reparation and reclamation. Before we get started, I also have some thank yous. Thanks to Joanna Green, my editor at Beacon, as well as Priyanka Ray, Christian Coleman, Allison Rodriguez, and the whole Beacon team. Thanks to Amanda Annis, my amazing agent at Trident Media, who helped me turn like a vague glimmer of an idea into a book. Thanks to Kate Bruns, who introduced us in such a lovely way tonight. Benjamin Quinn and the Harvard Bookstore team for their hard work making this event happen. Buy all the books and bags from them. Buy it all from Harvard Bookstore. Gotta support small bookstores. Thanks to my lovely and talented genius friend and comrade, Corinne Manning, for sharing the stage tonight. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you, Corinne. And thanks to all my families, especially my daughter, Nadia, who is the joy and center of my life, and Sarah Sohn, my partner in parenting and much, much more. Thanks to Rona and cousin XY, Grandma Adina, and all our disabled kin, Zikrana Livroka. Their memory is a blessing. So I'm going to begin at the beginning, as it were, and read the opening gambit, which frames the problem that I'm interested in. How delineating disability from family leads to trauma and ableism. And then I'm going to read a teeny bit of the end, which offers some, I don't want to say solutions, that's a little too easy, but some ways in, out, beyond this problem. You'll have to read the book to see how I get from that problem to possible solutions. And I'll then turn things over to Corinne, who I believe is going to read a little ditty from their ingeniously titled forthcoming book, Dirty Joke. It's a great title. We'll have a chat and then perhaps you'll chat back to us. So, and I'm going to read off the actual book. And I'll turn my camera off for a second so you can actually see the actual book, which is so exciting. Wow, it's a book with a messy office behind it. It'll do blur. Blur is always good for the background. Okay. Looking for lineage. I'm 7. I'm walking through room after room in my grandparents' cavernous Long Island house, looking for my cousin. Cousin, cousin, I call, wishing I knew his name. Cousin XY, I call. I know he's a boy and I'm a geneticist's daughter. Chromosomes count. Cousin XY visits me in dreams. He has his father's eyes. My cousin XY was born in 1972 with Down syndrome and immediately abandoned. He was listed only as baby XY. I always knew my aunt and uncle had, quote, given away their son at birth. His very existence was explained to me as a tragedy, a crisis, an aberration that perhaps science could one day prevent. In the hospital on the day he was born, so the story goes, his mother refused to look at his face, take him away. My grandfather, a family doctor, the family medical expert, was firm. Give him up. You can start over. You have a right to real children. He'll be happier there. Where was there? I often wondered where my cousin was, who he was. Silence and neurotypical children quickly replaced him in the family narrative, and on the rare occasions when his existence came up, everyone gave them away, was repeated as gospel truth. And indeed, in the 1970s, institutionalization, abandonment, and/or excision from the family narrative was still too often the fate of those labeled incurable at birth. But I discovered that wasn't the whole story. As with most families, the story of my family's disability lineage had far more strands than I realized. In 2017, when I was visiting a far-flung branch of my family in Manchester, UK, I discovered that there was another cousin in my family with Down syndrome, also on my father's side, buried in plain sight. Rona. Born in Scotland in 1946, 2 decades before cousin XY, Rona lived in apparent happiness, first with her nuclear family in Glasgow, and then in a group home called Cosgrove, which her mother helped found for disabled Jewish people. True to her name, Rona means joy in Hebrew. She lived a joyous Jewish life. 2 of my family members had been written out of the family story, delineated from our lineage. I mourned what I never had, both a lived relationship with my cousins and a family myth that could include them. I wondered how the knowledge of a rich, deep history of disability in my family would have changed my experience of my own daughter's diagnosis at age 2 as a disabled, non-speaking autistic person. If I had grown up playing with cousin XY, would we have experienced her disability as part of the warp and woof of our lineage, instead of as a personal disaster, rending us from the fabric of family? These were the questions that led me to think about disability and lineage and what the implications of repressing, hiding, finding, and celebrating it might be for disabled people and their families everywhere. By cutting me off from knowledge of my disabled cousins, I had no source of disability knowledge and history in my family. Their lives were treated as extraordinary, disposable, and traumatic. So traumatic that the very fact of them was hidden, erased from the story our family told about itself. This is typical of how disability is narrated in the family myths passed down from one generation to another. Disability is erased, repressed, covered over. Families delineate, destroy the connections between generations of disabled people, their families, and their caretakers. Our disabled kin are not merely misrepresented, they are written out of the story. By examining the ways families excise disability from their stories, I began to see how disability is fundamentally shaped by this omission. The way we assign meanings to bodies and minds, establish norms, and otherize and stigmatize according to perceptions of ability. In other words, ableism, that's that whole system of sorting and deciding some bodies matter, and some minds are valuable and some aren't, and creating, hierarchies, spectrums, all kinds of systems, right? That whole system is inseparable from how we name and claim our kin. Family is defined and produced by eradicating disability lineage, often making the inevitable appearance of disability within a given family a crisis, a trauma to be erased, effaced, unwritten. I refer to this process as delineation, the separation of disabled people from their lineage. The word delineate literally means to mark off with lines and thus separate. Now, this is the interesting part to me. It includes the word lineate, derived from lineage, family ancestry. So the delineation I'm examining here is sometimes literal, as with cousin XY. It's sometimes rhetorical, as with the suppression of my cousin Rona and her disability from the family narrative. But delineate also means to describe or portray, a form of inclusion, if you think about it, right? So within the word lies the potential to relineate, to sew a family member back into the fold, to describe, portray, and thus connect. I'm going to jump, like 100 some odd pages forward to do some of that relineation. Let's relineate. And this is from a section called Sewing the Ancestral Cloth, Weaving Us Together. That sounds rather grand. I guess I wrote that. You always rethink your titles once they're, printed in black and white. I'll switch to this side. So it looks like I'm about to give you the finger, but it's the ring finger, so it's okay. I wear my grandmother's ring on my fourth finger. It's an intricately carved, quirky little garnet, precious only to me. I'm married to my grandmother, I say to anyone who asks. It's a queer form of irony that marks my longest, deepest love, Adina Shaliff Lewis, a tiny, eccentric leftist, and if you know me, I'm under 5 feet. So if I say someone's tiny, they really are. A tiny eccentric leftist who adored me. A tiny eccentric leftist who adored me, Jewish folk dancing, and Adele Davis's health food regime, possibly in that order. Though she was a terrific student who tutored all the other kids, her father made her drop out of high school because she was a girl. Adina found a way out of poverty through a Jewish socialist community in New York, where she met and married my grandfather, Harold Hal Lewis, an educator and artist. Now, Adina never worked outside the home, couldn't drive, and I don't think ever wrote a check in her whole life. My grandfather managed everything, even by the standards of their generation's strictly defined gender roles. My grandparents were extreme. Yet they had one of the most loving partnerships I've ever witnessed. In their retirement home, the staff dubbed them the lovers because they were always holding hands or walking with the arm of my tall, handsome grandfather wrapped around my teeny grandmother's fragile frame. Only after they passed did I consider the way disability shaped this incredible partnership. Adina Shaliff Lewis was deaf. She hated her hearing aids and couldn't really lip read. She was hard of hearing from birth. I'm not sure exactly when she became officially deaf. My grandmother spoke of disability only with disgust. She saw disabled children as disposable tragedies. I can see the face she made when disability was mentioned. Tragic, but also disgusting. Was that how she felt about her own hearing impairment? Grandma Adina spoke in a near shout in heavily Yiddish-inflected Brooklynese. Fearful of the outside world, she was seemingly content to be a balabusta, a super housewife with left-wing leanings, who insisted that feminism meant the right to stay home. We had many debates about this subject. Completely cut off from any notion of disability as a positive identity or culture, Adina Shaliff Lewis was the most ebullient, loving presence in my life. She found everything I did worthy of celebration and made light of any annoying character traits that I revealed. You can see why I miss her. My mother inherited at a later age her impaired hearing, but not her shame. My mother lip reads, purchases every possible gadget to access or amplify sound and language, and religiously wears the latest and greatest hearing aids. Whereas Grandma Adina appeared to have little ambition, my mother went from a working class Brooklyn childhood to a marriage to a prominent scientist, to a career as a high school special ed teacher, to, at 50, a PhD from where? Why, yes, Harvard, and a second career as a college professor. She has published 3 books and has dedicated her life to training special education teachers and researching dyslexia. She could not be more interested in fully participating in the outside world. Her hearing impairment has increased steadily over the course of this noteworthy career. Yet only as I was finishing writing this book did I think of including two of the people closest to me, the women who formed me, who loved me the most, one whose ring I wear on my finger, and the other whose smile I wear on my face. Never considered including them in my disability lineage. Shame and stigma about disability are so great that I had internalized them, unconsciously refusing to acknowledge that my very own mother and grandmother were disabled in this way. For I would have had to confront another facet of my own ableism, my own fear of deafness. So in developing a disability lineage, we not only uncover lost, hidden, disappeared family members who were institutionalized, abandoned, murdered in some cases, or otherwise cut off from the family tree. We may also discover that the family members we never really thought of as disabled, who perhaps never thought of themselves as such, were and are disabled. By valuing the diversity of body minds among our kin, we rediscover the disability lineage right in front of our eyes, their deaf ears listening intently right across the dinner table from us. We also confront their erasure, how marginalized or otherwise mistreated they were because of their disabilities. And in the book, I talk about my own mistreatment at times of my grandmother and my mother, being rude about their hearing impairment, right? It's not that disability lineage is always hidden away. It was right there in front of us, but shame and stigma kept us from seeing it as our inheritance. So I'm going to read one more little section about that inheritance and what does it mean to claim it? What does it mean to celebrate disability? What does it mean to see disability as fluid and shared and not fixed, not spectrumized, not scaled in ways that delineate? Boy, these subtitles are really out of control. So this one's called Rending and Mending, the Fabric of the Universe. Wow, that's ambitious. How can I possibly live up to that? All right. Though we planned for 2 years, COVID-19 made us turn my daughter Nadia's bat mitzvah into a gil mitzvah, a sort of preamble to the main event to be held in a COVID-free future. Spoiler alert, we did hold it, but it was still COVID and on Zoom. Nadia prepared Torah commentary. I prepared to cry. We chose her dress together. We went online to Bloomingdale's, Grandma Dina's favorite store. I'm exposing my own bushiness here. Corinne will laugh at me for this, I hope. Grandma Dina adored the discounts and the unsweetened soft serve yogurt. Nadia adored all the dresses. I can't choose, she typed. Pick 2, I suggested. She chose 3. We ordered and hoped for the best. The purple plaid one with the unlikely metallic pink accents she finally chose to wear was gorgeously blingy and fit perfectly. Grandma Adina loved such unlikely color combinations. The gil mitzvah was more moving than I imagined anything on Zoom could ever be. Nadia's words, Nadia's prayers, Nadia's thoughts, Nadia's passion for Torah, for questions of God and speech and silence. I always say, I like everything about Judaism except God and Torah, just no interest. Nadia likes God and Torah. That's her main interest in Judaism. So there you go. Only when I was looking at the haphazard iPhone pics I took of us afterwards did I notice how Nadia's woven plaid echoed Rona's taffeta, same pattern, same confidence. The term lineage itself gestures towards this expanded sense of belonging, meaning a collective as well as an individual ancestry. This double sense of heritage is precisely where disability lineage and ancestry meet, where our personal family histories and personages join with the larger ancestral memory. I pray to my deaf grandmother and remember all our disabled grandmothers. A sense of belonging to a greater story is integral to all humans. In imagining a future in which I will certainly be disabled if I'm so lucky to be alive, I have my deaf grandmother to guide me. Grandma Adina can show me how to live joyously with a disability that she disowned during her own life. I have Rona now reclaimed in all her sass to help me better understand and care for my daughter. And I have cousin XY, whose absence still haunts me, but whom I feel more deeply connected with after this deep dive into our disability lineage. In my dreams, he plays cards with me in my grandfather's basement. Thank you, and now over to Corinne.
Oh, Jennifer, that ending is so beautiful. I'm so glad that you read that section. That moment too, for those of you who haven't read the book, there's this great moment of looking at this photograph of Rona, who is another disabled family member that Jennifer gets to learn about. And it is, this picture where the question is like, is it a wedding? Is it a bar mitzvah? And like that beautiful dress that she's wearing and that moment of connection between Nadia's dress and Rona's dress is just exquisite. So thank you for sharing that. Everyone should buy this book. It's so beautiful. I am going to do just a very short reading, and then I'm really excited to be in conversation with Jennifer about all our families, which you all should buy. I should drop that link again into the chat. My name is Corinne Manning. I am a fiction writer, and I am going to be reading the opening of a book that I'm working on, which is sort of a retelling of Dante's Divine Comedy, where Corinne descends into a hell that you don't have to die to go to, and it's proliferated with Italian Americans, which is my ancestry. And my Virgil, for those of you who are familiar with Dante's Inferno, is Pier Paolo Pasolini. And you might as well look at the picture of him because he's so beautiful. He's a filmmaker who was very controversial and was murdered in the 70s. So this is the first canto I'll read a little bit of. Halfway through the story of my life, I came to what the baby I raise calls a spooky wood, a pooky wood, which is every wood in the Pacific Northwest if you aren't used to it. The mist was low in the branches, the usnea dangled like emerald beards. The nettle was tall, but I liked its sting, especially when it reminded me that I could feel something else, anything else than the abuse. See, there are other pains that linger too. It wasn't becoming a parent that led me off the path or the memory of abuse that overloaded my senses. I didn't know I was off a path or on one. I walked only to try to live. I was used to the springy ground, but I was never very good at finding trails, always getting lost on hikes and often getting people lost with me. Once with a few friends, I scrambled through a brush not unlike the narrow blackberry bramble I squeezed my way through in this canto. Back then, as we climbed, the sharp branches scratched the skin between our socks and hiking shorts, and we bled in rivulets like saints. We reached the top of the hill, and at a distance was a tent, and we slipped down the loose rocks, rolled on our asses, and ran towards hope. However, in this case, when I got through the blackberry, I was back on a kind of path, but blocked by a cougar growling, a sound I never heard before, and at first I thought I was just hearing wings flapping rapidly. I knew I couldn't outrun the cat and that you shouldn't run away from a cougar anyway, especially one, as it turned out, that had 2 cubs playing around her feet. I made myself as large as I could, expanded my arms wide, and taking a friend's advice, sang the first song that came to my head, which had also been the first song that came to her head. It's a small world after all. It's a small world after all. It's a small world after all. It's a small, small world. Sorry about that, everyone. That's in your head for the night. But the cougar didn't budge. I think she laughed at me and stepped closer, and I could smell her and even see the way her cheeks quivered from her sounds. Then just above me on a ledge I hadn't seen stood a shape that was almost the figure of a man, standing tall and mute. I screamed because even the thought of a ghost will scare me more than the threat that I faced here, my throat being scratched open. What are you? I cried to the figure above me. The cougar stopped her growl and stepped back some, still watching me, but lightly tucking her cubs a bit down the path. Turns out you're loud, the figure said. Fuck, I hate speaking English. He had an accent I recognized, like you know an old meal or house. Sorry, I said. Are you alive? Once was, the state killed me. Fascists killed me. They say rough trade killed me. They say I had it coming. I was just gore and pulp at the end. What's new, right? It's because people knew me and not just fags and dykes like you. Is that what you are? I see people are sensitive about this now, which is good. We should keep people nervous about what we can be. I made films. You've seen them. I redid the plague text to Cameron, and everyone was nervous, even though people forget, in their own supposed nation, how desperate for subversion we are. In another film, two soldiers danced together. Crisis. Pier Paolo Pasolini, I said. He smiled, childlike and satisfied. You've seen my films. Yes, I love them, mostly. I paused, considering how honest I wanted to be. I dipped my head to the side to appear more humble. I think they were more upset about Saulo, the scalping, the rape, and eating shit. The fascism, too. Bella, the world is always fine with rape and scalping, especially when soldiers do it. Totally, I said, totally. And that's what I love about your films, that directness. Plus, they make me feel so dirty and weird. At this, he smirked, and I didn't feel good about it. I can't decide if that's because you are American or middle class. My parents weren't middle class. Well, first generation of it is the worst. And I'm going to stop there. The cougar does not eat Corinne or Pierre. Let's get into conversation with Jennifer. Jennifer, thank you for that beautiful reading. I'm so grateful that we get to be here together. And one of the things that I'm really grateful about this moment to have conversation with you and about your book is the way that, you kind of invite in that like extended ancestry of disability. It gave me a really amazing chance to kind of think and connect to like my own disabled grandmothers and other family members. And so I just wanted to thank you for that. And one of the things I think I would just like love to jump in with is there's this beautiful scene that takes place at, there's so many beautiful scenes, everyone, in this book. The way that Jennifer weaves theory in with real lived experience is just so lovely. But there's this beautiful scene in the book that takes place at a holiday dinner where you're having this experience and joy of, you use the term of real access intimacy. You describe that as not having to explain or apologize for our family's disabilities. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this notion of gain. You talk about this notion of care gain and disability gain as part of a disability lineage.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you, Corinne, for that lovely, intriguing reading. And I'll have questions for you about that. But I think the first thing is that what I mostly wrote this book for is to encourage other people to seek out and reimagine their own disability lineage, to imagine that they had one. So when you said, it made me think about my disabled grandmothers and, how that's woven in or delineated, right? So that's the real purpose of the book, isn't just to do this for me and reimagine what disability lineage can be and why it matters if we're going to actually destigmatize disability, right? But to really invite others to do so. So in terms of, the term disability gain comes from deaf culture. And it suggests that you don't have to sugarcoat the challenges of impairment, right, which are real, to see gain and value that can come with a disability. And I talk about, the empathy and close listening. Jennifer Pasteloff kind of came up with this, that you listen a different way if you have to really pay attention to people to hear it all, right? And all the people in my family who have any level of hard of hearing or hearing impairment are really good listeners, right? And that doesn't take away from the challenges. My daughter has an incredibly complicated relationship to language as a non-speaking autistic person, and writes these startling poems that are just not like anyone else's, you know? So it doesn't outweigh impairment. It doesn't, make it disappear. But there's a lot to be learned from valuing the particular ways that disability can actually enhance life for the disabled person and for other people too. So I was thinking about at that scene about the Thanksgiving, that it was sort of the first time we gathered at one of those holidays, problematic holiday, family holidays, with people who weren't our biological family. Like the three of us are related, but right, we're with non-biological family. And there was what Mia Mingus calls like intimacy access, where you don't have to explain anything. There's just a comfort level. And that was something that we only got from owning and valuing our disability. If we were only looking at this as a medical problem to be solved, right? If we were ashamed and stigmatized, if we accepted that, we wouldn't have found a community of people, right? So I think that's part of what disability lineage really can sort of enable, is if you can't own and claim this as an identity, right? If you're full of shame and stigma, and imagine yourself as the only person who's ever had a disability in your family. So it's traumatic, there's no lineage, it comes from nowhere, and it separates you from everyone. So I think understanding this as an identity doesn't take away from impairment. You'll find nobody more pro-medicine than me. Sign me up for all the pills, all the things. But it's part of the human condition to be disabled, right? Basically. And if we can get comfortable with that, we can find community, we can find ease. And I think that's crucial to destigmatizing.
I love how you say that that's part of the human condition to be disabled. And then this thought of like that we can find this intimacy within like the history of our own family. I have, as you know, Jennifer, I have chronic Lyme, and it was something, and then I also have a number of other things that I've like inherited. And one of the things that when I initially had my diagnosis, I had other family members who had Lyme, had gotten over it quickly. So it was this like failure, that it was this like chronic issue. And for me, like that shame was so there initially until I really like acknowledged and looked at, my grandmother who had Parkinson's, my uncle who had MS, like my brother who has, hypotriglycemia and pancreatitis. So like there's just all these ways in which like having this lineage of the body having to have these periods of different activity, different kinds of rest, and being able to like think of these people both in my times of like having a different kind of access to my body than others. It's just very fulfilling. So I really appreciate how you speak to that. That is like just so expansive.
And I do want to say, I don't identify as disabled. I don't have any condition that under the ADA or under any of the various sorting mechanisms, puts me in that category. If I live so long, if I live to age 60, about 40% of people age 60 and over by the most mainstream medical definition are considered disabled, right? I'm 55, so I've got 5 years, right? But nonetheless, by thinking about disability lineage and kind of valuing disability and engaging a really radically different model of what a body is, what it's supposed to do, what a mind is. It changes my everyday life, not just in relation to my daughter, but for example, I am wearing a retainer that has a fake tooth to keep two teeth separated. And why am I oversharing this? It makes me slightly lisp, but it's medically better for me to keep it in as long as possible. I think when I was in the trauma model of disability, I would have taken it off so that everyone could hear me maximally clearly and, you know, put my head like this so nobody could see, right? And what if I show up as I am, right? With the body mind that I am right now? What if I ask you to accommodate that? Listen more closely because I'm slightly lisping. What if I don't buy into the notion of the normate, the ideal body mind that actually nobody has? So I think even if you're not disabled, even if there's value to finding your disability lineage, valuing it, seeing this as a normal, ordinary part of life, and rethinking your own relationship to your body and mind and their function and dysfunction, and valuing how you are right now. Whoops, you're muted.
On that, there's an interesting kind of conversation that is like up in the audience of, you know, this idea of like you write how fear of disability equals the fear of care. And the attendee asks, like, how might we systemically challenge or ease families' fear of care for their disabled family members?
Yeah, you know, I don't claim to have all the answers. These are complex questions, right? I think one part of it is systemic change, right? But if we continue to imagine disability as rare, extraordinary, something we repress and hide, we can't see its ubiquity. So that's part of the problem, is that we continue to pretend this is this thing that happens to those other people, right? So that's part of where disability lineage and reclaiming disability lineage comes in thinking about things like care, right? And so I think that's a big piece of it. And then I kind of build on the work of other people who've really done the rigorous scholarship around the race and gendered nature of care, which I think COVID kind of exposed, that the vast majority of job losses under COVID were women who had to leave the workplace to do this uncompensated care work. And there's a whole racist system of who does the care work at what wages. So I think understanding that care work is a thing that's going to be a part of all of our lives, and rethinking how we pay for it, value it, all of that stuff, we can't really do if we keep having this sort of dishonest relationship with disability, is how I think about it. That's the thing that happens to other people. And I use the phrase, as long as it's healthy, right? Which has sort of replaced in, you know, as this sort of formulaic conversation. Do you want a boy or a girl? I don't care as long as it's healthy, right? This is the conversation one is allowed to have that, you know, displaces ideas about gender onto ideas about care and disability in this sort of pernicious way, to hide that actually it absolutely matters what gender a person is, because of what their care narrative is going to be, right? So I think that's, and that it's still fine to say, I only want a child as long as they're healthy. Well, if you've ever had an infant, none of them are healthy. They're all sick all the time, you know, right? You're going to throw it back if it's disabled? Like, well, what is this rhetoric that's incredibly ableist and exposes just this whole nexus of dishonest, racist, genocidal, sexist, you name it, ist, a cluster of things that keep us from really addressing care and disability and kinship in a meaningful way.
Well, let's talk about that. I love this. One of my moments that struck me the most is like, as long as it's healthy narrative. And I love how you kind of point out that, like, you know, that a more like politically correct or potentially like, you know, liberal person might say this exact thing, like, I don't care about the gender as long as it's healthy. And how that from the moment, like, you know, before the fetus becomes, you know, a creature that is born, there is this ableism that is both put on the person carrying as well as this person ultimately.
Right. So before we're even born, this is the narrative. And, you know, care actually matters a lot in terms of outcome. Down syndrome is the test case. The outcomes for people with Down syndrome have changed extraordinarily since deinstitutionalization. The average lifespan has almost doubled. With not a single medical intervention. There is no cure, there is no medical treatment. None of that has changed. What's changed is care. So, you know, I think that's not me, that's the scientists and researchers and, you know, all the people who work on Down syndrome. So care matters to outcomes. And we're dishonest about disability to avoid a real conversation about care. Do we want to take some more of these in the chat, in the Q&A? Maybe you can connect some of yours. Now I'm being teacherly and bossy.
Well, you've been teaching all day. Yeah, so one of the things I want to, there's a question from Linda Morrison, but I want to, that kind of ties into a question that I want to ask, which is this notion, like, kind of like on that topic of, you know, as long as it's healthy, that like this result of like failure, right? Failure of the person carrying, failure of the child, if the child is disabled, and that fear of care and the disgust that I think that a lot of people have towards care, a lot of that coming from, you know, the culture. Or, do we say culture? Because of whiteness, because of white supremacy. And one of the things I'm curious is like how you explored in your own experience the view of failure of the family on a disabled child. And I want to also offer to tie this in with Linda about what to do when you're the only disabled person in your family.
Yeah. So yeah, this comes up a lot in the writings of like brilliant disability justice writers who I try to center in my book, like Stacey Milburn, RIP, and others who sort of turn to sort of like an imaginary ancestry of disabled predecessors, right? Because they say there's nobody disabled in my family. What I say is, you know, you have to expand the web of, you know, there were people who were disabled, who've been buried, who've been excised from the story. And even if you can't find them, right? Even if you search and you just find nothing, you know, it's lost, imagining that they were, I think, is an act of restorative justice. I really do think so. Like, assume there were actually, maybe not in your nuclear family, but in your lineage, there are disabled people. And imagining that, I think, is so crucial. And the second part of, I think, Linda's question was about, you know, not only not having disabled people in your family, but all the pressure to mask, to you know, in autism circles, it's called masking, when autistic people are expected to behave non-autistically and at great cost to themselves, right? So there's a lot of pressure to mask, to hide, to sort of conform to the family's non-disabled culture, right? And, you know, I think that's where finding kinship beyond your nuclear or biological family, kinship with a disabled people, is important. And, you know, people have different levels of comfort with confrontation, but, you know, we show up with my daughter as she is. We don't tell her to stop stimming. We don't, you know, and wherever it's safe to do so. And I talk about being disabled in public and where it's not and how I handle that. But I think, insisting that, if you want us, you will take us as we are, I think is really important, showing up. And then looking beyond, looking at kinship in a more expanded way. And that's where the identity piece comes in, understanding disability as culture and identity and not just impairment, right?
Yeah. Someone in the chat brings up Andrew Solomon's Far from the I mean, and you bring up that as a fantastic critique in this book of you'll be able to say the image way better than I could, but this notion of like, well, apple falls from the tree and is still part of the tree and is still in relationship with the tree. I don't know if you want to say
yes.
I don't know if you to anything to that critique, and then also maybe some of the antidote books to that for you.
Yeah. I feel like I am the odd apple out in that I seem to be the only person I've ever met who just got nothing from that book, except I experienced it as so oppressive and horrible. And every single person I know besides me, liked it. So I tried to figure out why. And I do he's a foil for me a little bit to make my own argument. He can take it. He's super rich, he's a bestseller, his movies made. So I think the problem is it's kind of goes back to what Linda was talking about, that it's still asking, suppose this normate parent, this parent who couldn't possibly be disabled, he doesn't imagine disabled parents, has to work to accept this child who is so other. And I really question both the otherness and why are disabled people any more other than anyone else? Every child is other to its parent inherently. And if you don't understand that as a parent, that's a problem actually. If you're just looking to replicate yourself, that's not so good. And so I really don't accept this idea that I think we have to undo the ableism that leads a parent to imagine that only a non-disabled child could occur. There's a failure of imagination, right? And sort of the as long as it's healthy narrative. So this idea, acceptance, tolerance, this stuff always stabilizes a really phobic regime, whether it's, around queer people or anything else, basically. So I'm just trying to think about the branches of the tree, right? And how do you connect, how they lineate, the roots, the branches, the apples, all of it, instead of this kind of binary opposition between the apple and the tree.
Yeah. And I think as Mia Mingus says, this idea of leaving evidence, ultimately leaving evidence of this lineage in our family. So.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you, Corinne.
Conversation with me. Is there anything else that you would like to add and offer out to the audience before we close?
No, I'm so thankful for everyone who's supporting the book. And I just wanted to say thank you to Corinne and her many lineages of Dante and Pasolini and guides, that kind of seeking of lineage in literature can be part of our disability lineage as well. The blind storyteller, the storyteller is always blind in Greek mythology, right? So Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I will just pop in with a closing and add to our thank yous. This was such a compassionate and fascinating conversation tonight. I learned a tremendous amount myself, and I really hope that those joining us online did too, and those who are able to watch this video later online. So thank you, all of you out there, for asking such thoughtful, intelligent questions in the chat tonight, and for spending your evening with us. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, have a great night. Please keep reading and be well. Thanks, everyone.